And I'm very glad that you reminded us about that incident involving those 3 Liberal MPs, federal MPs, and the Victorian Supreme Court.
Court of Appeal.
Court of Appeal, I should say, yes. Now, but just to get back to the email from Justice Harrison, that was an unsolicited email. It wasn't intended for publication, but of course, Pat Conahan forwarded it to the Australian, and it's now, available for public consumption. But I mean, I think the key point here is that, this wasn't even a debate between 2 people who knew each other. It was just an unsolicited email accusing someone, a representative of an electorate, of being disgusting and racist. It's a bit over the line, isn't it, Scott?
Well, I thought so on any number of grounds, one of which, and I'll just mention 2. The first of all is he called it disgusting, paternalistic and racist. And I invite anyone to have a look at that speech. That's what I did when I wrote to IPA members about it. I provided a link to the speech. I thought this was a man of goodwill in an electorate based around Lismore with a significant Indigenous population, whose family is, his father was the doctor in that town, who had a lot of Indigenous patients, and so he talked about that. Now, if that's paternalistic, I just don't know how you can actually talk about people in your own hometown in a way that would satisfy Justice Harrison's test of not being paternalistic. So that was the first issue, and the other is, in amongst that unsolicited email, he did say there are no constitutional issues in play here. Now that, as we know, Fred, is something that is a matter of dispute. Justice Ian Callanan, former Justice of the High Court, amongst others, has been someone who said that the referendum, if successful, would lead to vast litigation and, he didn't say can of worms, but to paraphrase, open a can of worms in the Constitution. So for Justice Harrison just to assert that there are no constitutional issues, it's completely inappropriate.
Well, I think you put it very succinctly in your piece, actually. You said, and this is the voice won't have, the argument for the voice is that it won't have any power beyond offering advice, that there is no obligation to accept the advice. But you say in your piece, and I quote, "Any matter involving the Constitution must necessarily be subject to review by the High Court." And what would the High Court find when it looked at the Constitution? Well, there's two points there. Necessarily be subject to review by the High Court. I think that's beyond question, really, and which does lead us to the question you ask, what would the High Court find? And we don't know, do we, Scott?
Well, that's right. And what we've got to do, Fred, is, of course, roll forward. The Constitution is 123 years old. It's been in effect. So it's not about a case next year where, they're fresh from the debate and we know what Anthony Albanese said, don't worry about that. Let's roll forward, 10, 20 years, a whole new bench. And what are they looking at? So they're looking at the words in the Constitution, and what I was pointing out. So that's all they have in front of them. They're not. It's only later, if they need to, that they might try and divine the intent of the legislators. But what they would see in the Constitution is that the Voice to Parliament has its own chapter, and I was very struck by this in the when you actually dig out the Constitution. It's only a rule book, of course. There's no great screeds like you have in coming out of the United States, and there are only 8 chapters. And what you find is that the first 3 chapters reflect the classic separation of powers. You have the executive, the parliament, and the judiciary, and the separation of powers is really at the heart of our liberal democratic system. It was enunciated in the mid-18th century by Montesquieu. The American founding fathers picked it up, and we essentially wrote it into our Constitution. But there's only 8 chapters. We're about to add a 9th. It is proposed that we add a 9th. So this future High Court would say, well, where do I rank the Voice to Parliament alongside these existing arms of government? Well, each one of those has a chapter. and the Voice to Parliament has a chapter.